Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 139 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about games on the trail. Now, as someone who typically solo hikes and spends a lot of time by myself and blogging on the trail, I generally find that I don't have a lot of spare time available. Usually I'm hiking from early in the morning till late in the afternoon, and once I've had dinner and caught up on my blogging, I find I'm pretty tired and I tend to head off to bed. But in all honesty, most people who hike will often hike as couples or in larger groups. They'll hike in family units, and generally you'll find that most people will do a lesser frantic pace than I do, and will usually have more time available.
Do you know, we hike together sometimes, you know.
Okay.
You sound as if you do this all on your own.
Occasionally.
And when we do, though, I do agree that we don't have a lot of time, because while you're doing all the blogging, I'm putting up the tent and doing all of the other stuff. Isn't that right, Tim?
That's right. So I think if you look at a lot of the trails, the longer distance trails when you're overnighting, that provide huts or campsites, they typically tend to be set apart around about the 15 to 20 kilometre mark. Now, for a fit hiker who's into multi-day hiking, that's not an unrealistic sort of distance, but it means that if you do sort of start early in the morning, you're likely to be getting to camp probably about mid to late afternoon and have plenty of spare time available. If you're travelling with kids, you may be looking at activities that are going to keep them excited and stop them from getting bored. And that's what we're going to look at in today's episode, is playing games on the trail, just to provide a bit of a diversion.
Yeah, and it's not just for the kids too. You know, it's for anybody who needs a bit of entertainment and a bit of distraction, I guess, from potentially a hard day hiking.
Okay, so we're going to look at some options in today's episode. We hope you enjoy. Now, the first series of games that I'll go through and talk about is conversation games. And these are games that don't require any specialised pieces of equipment and can be played fairly easily and fairly readily, and most people will be familiar with most of these. Now, the first game that most people will be familiar with is I Spy. I say most people will be familiar with. Here the assumption is that as Australians or Americans or British, it's a game that most people are aware of. I'm sure there are similar versions in other languages, but you may find that there might be some differences. So don't assume that people know what I Spy is. This is a game that in most cases, two or more players, and I think, as I said, most of us have played this as children, if not as adults. And basically it's a guessing game where one player chooses an object within sight and announces to the other player that I spy with my little eye something beginning with, and he might say the letter T. Now, choosing something like T, the obvious response is going to be tree. Probably not the best thing to pick when you're out hiking. So
the idea is to make it a little bit of a challenge and perhaps not pick hidden things, but things that are not so obvious.
Now, with these games we're talking about at the moment, these can be played at camp, or they can also be played while hiking. So if you are going to be doing this while you're hiking, you want to make sure that if this game's going to take 5 or 10 minutes, that the object you spy is still there by the time you finish the game.
I think there are many parents who've been on a road trip who've been driven insane by I Spy, so I'm not sure that would be on the top of my list.
Main thing with this sort of game is if you are playing this with kids, pick something that's reasonably that you would expect them to know what it is. Don't pick something that's so hard that you have to have a science degree to work out what you're looking at.
Yeah, steer away from the botanical names maybe.
And if you are playing this or the other games we're about to talk about while you are hiking, be conscious that you are paying attention to the navigation and your safety, and that you're also taking in the environment as well. You don't want to be so focused on the game that you're not actually thinking about your surrounding environment. The next game we're going to look at is Two Truths and a Lie. And again, this is two or more players. And this is a good opportunity to find out about your travelling partners. And basically, the first player will start off and make three statements. Two of them are true and one of them's a lie. And again, this takes a bit of creativity not to make them so obvious. So saying that I have three arms, unless you do actually have three arms, is probably not going to be a good sort of clue to say, well, I think that's probably a one that's pretty false, so we can rule that one out. So you want to make them challenging, but not so impossible that you can't guess. So an example I'll use here, and again, I'll make three statements. Two of them are true, one of them isn't.
And I have to guess, do I?
And you have, well, it's a bit hard on this one. So the three examples I've given here: my hair was a reddish colour up to the age of 5. I share the same birthday as my wife. Now, as my wife, you'll know what the answer to that one is. And that I was born in Cyprus. And basically, the people you're playing with have to guess which one of those is true and which are actually false.
So the last one is false, Tim, just so you know that I really do understand you and know what you're about.
But having said that, I was actually born overseas. So, if people know that I was born overseas, they may not be aware of which country I was born in. Now, the true answer here is that I share the same birthday as my wife. So, again, not a good example if you are playing with your wife in this sort of situation.
Yeah, that wasn't very challenging, was it?
Now, once you've got an outcome, you move on to the next person. So, as I said, it's a good icebreaker game. If you're playing this with a group of people that you haven't met before or don't know so well, it's a good opportunity to get to know somebody. The third option here in the conversation type games is one called situation puzzles, or lateral thinking puzzles is another name. And again, these are all open for two or more players. And this involves basically spinning a short story that provides other participants a starting point to ask questions to try and solve the puzzle. Now, the example that I've used here is a man walks into a bar and asks the bartender for a drink of water. The bartender pulls out a gun, points at the man and cocks it. The man pauses before saying thank you and leaves. What happened? Now, ultimately what the people involved, or the people who are trying to guess what this little puzzle is about, is they're trying to work out why the person asked for a drink, why the bartender pointed a gun. And in this case here, you can only answer yes, no, or if it's something totally off base, you can either say irrelevant, or you might say, look, it's not a valid question. It's not really worthwhile pursuing that line if you want to go a bit more further in depth.
So my job would be to ask questions.
Your job would be to ask questions to try and work out what the answer is.
What time of day was it? That doesn't work because it's not a yes or a no answer.
So I might say in that instant, irrelevant. So the answer that you're trying to get to here is the bartender realised that the person asking for a glass of water had hiccups, and that by frightening the man with a gun, you cured the hiccups. Now that's one example here. I remember playing this as a 13-year-old with a group of 7 other 13-year-olds at a camp in the late 1970s.
Whoa!
And it took us around about an hour to go through and solve the puzzle. And that, we weren't asking questions for an hour solid. We were sort of taking breaks, having a thought about what was going on. If you go to the written version of this podcast, we've got a link to a book that has a number of these puzzles. And while you wouldn't necessarily take the book with you on a hike, you might photocopy or write down the question and take a couple with you, so you're going to have minimal sort of weight. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is 20 questions. And this is a game that a lot of people will be familiar with and involves two or more players. So one person comes up with a place or thing or person, but doesn't tell what the rest of the players that is. So as an example here, I might think of eggplant, and Jill would have 20 questions to try and come up with that answer.
So can you say, is it animal, mineral or vegetable?
No. Well, sorry, in that case here, that's not a yes or no question, so I can't really answer that. You've wasted a question.
So is it a plant?
Yes.
Okay, that was lucky.
That was lucky.
Because I knew what an eggplant was.
Yeah, there's a bit of hint there in the word. So you'd go through your questions and try and say, is it something you eat? And you might say, okay, what colour? You might say, is it purple or is it red? And try and narrow the questions down. Mm-hmm. And you've got 20 questions. So while that may seem a lot, you may find that you start getting through the questions pretty quickly.
Yeah, and if you know people well, and they know you well, you could be asking questions of like, do I have one? Do I like one? Do I, use one?
Yeah, and Jill's question from it, is it a plant? The next question might be, is it a vegetable? And again, that's going to start narrowing it down to the common vegetables. And I think eggplant is probably one of those ones that for a lot of people, your third question might be, do I like this particular vegetable?
Yeah, so once you get through potato, tomato, peas, corn, carrots. you've lost a few questions, haven't you?
You have, yeah. So you might ask, is it a particular colour? Is it purple, as an example? But again, it's up to you to try and think about what the other person's likely to be thinking about, and that's just one example. It might be you might be thinking of a famous person like a prime minister, or you may be thinking of a place, a country. So there's all sorts of options here. There's the advantage of this game is there's really no end to the questions that you can go through and ask. Now, again, keep this age related. It's no good asking a 5-year-old child the chemical elements or the elements of the periodic table. It might be a bit of a waste of a game, and they're going to get a bit upset with that one in most cases.
Well, they could be an incredibly intelligent child.
They could. And the last one in this conversational type category is the alphabet game. Again, 2 or more players. And for this game, you pick a topic. So again, in this case, we're going to pick animals, but it could be country or something, prime ministers or anything else you want. But it needs to be a reasonably broad sort of topic, because what you're going to do is work your way through the alphabet. So in this case here, we've chosen animals. And if I go first, I'll say aardvark. Jill now has to pick a animal, and it can be generic or specific, that starts with B.
Bear.
Bear, yep. Okay, I'll go next is C, cat.
Dog.
Yep, and so on. Now,
I'm glad we're stopping there.
Yeah. It gets fairly easy in most cases, but start ending up with W or Z or X. In all honesty, trying to think of an animal that starts with X, I'm sure they do exist, but I'd have to really stop and think about what the answers there would be. Yeah. And it may be that, there mightn't be a particular type of animal, but it might be a type of penguin or a type of whatever that starts with the letter X. And that's where it starts, or countries that starts with the letter X. It starts becoming really hard.
Now, I'm about to say something that I'm sure Tim will disagree with, and that's this is supposed to be fun, and it's not necessarily about winning, but it is about having a bit of fun and, being a bit creative and keeping everybody, interested and happy. Isn't that right, Tim?
It is.
We'll get on to that in a minute, I'm sure.
Okay, so now we're going to look at board games and card games. And this doesn't involve so much thinking because generally the rules are set out for you and you're not having to come up with anything or think of anything that's off the top of your head. Now, when I talk about board games here, I'm not talking about taking a full set of Scrabble or Monopoly on the hike with you.
You could if you want.
That's always possible, and you can actually buy travel sets of these. But in this case here, we've gone through and there is so much choice here and so many options, but I've tried to keep it limited to games that are accessible to 2 players or more, games that are lightweight. And so in most of the cases, the examples we're going to look at here are under 200 grams, and also games that are well known as well. So, and the first one here is Uno. This is a game is 175 grams in weight. It'll suit 2 to 10 players. The object of Uno is to be the first player to get rid of your cards in each round and score points for the cards your opponents are left holding. So it might be that, between 2 or 3 other players, there's the cards add up to 30. So you might have to play 10 rounds to win that. So
you have to get to 500.
Yeah. Now, in all honesty, you can make up the rules as you go here. You might.
Yeah, if in doubt, if you forget the instructions, just make it up.
And you might say, look, I don't want to play that many games. There's only 2 of us. So you might say, well, it can be first to 200 or first to 100. So really, you can vary what you do here. This is a fairly well-known game. I think most kids are probably aware of it, and most kids have played it these days. And it's a good option. Next card game, and again, I chose this one specifically for what it is, and it's a card game called Backpacker. Now, when we're talking about backpack here, we're talking about backpacking as opposed to hiking. So it's travelling around the world. And the aim of the game is to win the game. You need to be the player with most photos safely back home. And that means the most points. And you go travelling to a number of places around the world and collect photos. And there are obstacles that are put in your place. So as an example, a card I'm looking at here is sickness. Lose the country on top of your pile into the past pile. Miss a go, and everyone must pass a card to the left. And if you hold this card, you can't actually go home. So you need to lose the card before you go home, which means you either need to lose points or somehow pass it off onto somebody else.
So you get better by giving it to someone else, is that right?
Yeah, you get better by giving it to somebody else, and they get stuck with this card. So this is the heaviest game in what we're looking at in this group. It's 205 grams. It suits 2 to 6 players, and there's an easy version or a hard version. So it really depends on how familiar you are with the game itself. Next game we're going to look at is basically a mini deck of cards, weighs 44 grams, not too much bigger than a matchbox. You can actually take a full-size deck of cards if you really want to, and it really depends. I mean, if you're going to be going out for a few months and you want a decent set of cards and your eyesight's not particularly good, you might want a bigger set. But for 44 grams, it works pretty well.
And it's mini as in size rather than there are less cards in the pack.
Yeah, so you've got
still 52 cards.
There's still 52 cards, yep. You've still got the choice of playing things like solitaire as a single person. You can play poker. You can play any other number of games that you might be familiar with. And it's fairly versatile and fairly lightweight.
And I think most people know how to play at least one card game as well. So it's quite universal.
From here, we also move on to another familiar game, and that's Dominoes. Now, there's lots of different domino sets available on the market. The one that we have, which we're going to talk about, weighs 120 grams. So, again, it's not particularly heavyweight. In fact, it's lighter than some of the card games we're going to look at, and will suit 2 to 5 players. I won't go into the rules of Dominoes. This set that we have here has the rules that come with it, and you can, again, play this with 2 players quite comfortably. It's a fairly robust sort of game. If you really want to, you can lose the box and just put it into a small bag, and that'll lighten it even further. But the box actually keeps it all in one spot and keeps it protected.
Yeah, and I think Dominoes is another one of those games that, is relatively universal, that most people will have come across. So, no matter how well you know people or where they're from, they're probably going to be able to engage in a game.
Now we're on to something that's probably a bit different than most people are familiar with, and this is Monopoly. Now, we're not talking about the full board game. We're talking about the Monopoly card game. And what this does is it turns the Monopoly board game into a set of cards, and the aim of the game is to collect property cards, and the game wins when one player collects 3 or more property sets in different colours. And this is available for 2 to 5 players. There's 110 cards in total, and the game itself weighs 152 grams. So if you're familiar with playing Monopoly, you've got to convert this into how you play it with the cards, but it works in a very similar sort of ways. You have property cards, you put houses or house and a hotel on them. You have a bank that you work with, and you have to pay rent if you land on or potentially land on what the equivalent of landing on someone else's properties. So you get an action card or a rent card in this case saying play a rent card to force players to pay you rent as described on the card. And basically the winner, as I said, is the first one that owns 3 sets of different colour property cards or property sets. It's a good option for a familiar game that's will keep people amused for a period of time. The last game we're going to talk about is Liar's Dice or Poker Dice. This game here can be played with a normal set of dice. You need 5 of them. And there's a couple of different options here, but usually the way I'm used to playing this is with one set of dice that are used between 2, 3, 4, 5 players. It doesn't really matter. You can also play this if every player has a set of dice. You can play it with as many players as you like. But one set works quite well, and what you're trying to do is these dice, if you have a look at the pictures on the written version of this podcast, it has a king, a queen, an ace, a 10 and a 9 card on each of the sides of the dice. So if I roll the dice and say I have 5 kings, and then I pass the dice over to Jill, pretty much she's left in a no-win situation. The only thing she can roll to beat me is going to be 5 aces. And if she rolls the dice and says she has 5 aces, I'm more than likely going to think, what are the chances of that? And if she says that, I'll call her out and say, you're lying. Now, if I'm wrong, I lose. Because
you call me a liar, you would really lose.
Because what are the chances that you roll 5 of the same dice? But it may be that you roll the dice and you get a pair of 10s, but you might say, I've got 3 10s. And that's a believable sort of scenario. So
this is a bit challenging because you've got to roll the dice without anybody seeing your dice. Is that?
Yeah. Normally, if you do this in a home, you'd have a dice cup and you roll them out of the cup. You don't show what people look like. So here you have to roll them behind your hand. So you need a piece of flat ground or a bench or something you can. The floor of the tent's fine. So it's the sort of thing. It's a matter of how well you can bluff, and I suppose if you're playing poker, a lot of bluffing is involved. You don't necessarily have what you say you've got. You're trying to get people to call you bluff. Playing this as a multiple set of dice with multiple players, you can play it slightly differently, where everyone rolls their dice at once. In this case, you might end up with everybody saying we have 5 kings, and then it's a matter of saying, well, okay, it's in that case here, everyone would show 1 king and then 2 kings,
and potentially everybody could be lying.
Yeah, and everyone could be lying, but if you might end up with you've got 4 kings, and everyone else is bluffing. And if you...
Yeah, this hasn't quite grabbed me, Tim, this one, because again, I'd come back to you probably don't want to have too many debates with people about their honesty, do you? Particularly if you don't know them very well.
The good thing with the Liar's Dice or Poker Dice is that, basically 26 grams of dice, including the bag it comes in.
It's light. That's it.
Lightweight. Yeah.
That's the only thing it's got going for it.
It is. So whether you want to go down that route or not, again, I suppose it's like anything with something like this, you potentially can cause arguments, but it can be the same with cards as well. So, it's a bit like, with a deck of cards, you can play Snap or you can play Go Fish. And I always love playing Go Fish with the young children who always say, "Oh no, I don't have any fives," and you know that they have, but they're just lying to you. Maybe
you don't have to be a child to lie.
Yeah, maybe it's the group of kids that I tend to hang around.
Yeah.
All right, so these are really a number of options for playing games or having fun on the trail if you think you need it. And as I said, for Jill and I, it's something we've never bothered doing. We normally have plenty to keep us amused. We're doing blogging, we're writing in journals, we're having dinner, we're going to sleep fairly early.
We're talking,
we're going to sleep, we're talking. So there's plenty of options through there. But when you've got a family involved or you've got a number of hours at a campsite and you haven't got a book, it's a good option to go through.
Yeah, and I think I would sort of get you to focus on things that are going to be fun, potentially things that are easy to play, and the games that most people will enjoy. So particularly if you're travelling with a group of people you know well, if there are games that you're playing when you're not hiking, then they may be great games to play while you are hiking as well. If you are with a group of people you don't know so well, then perhaps don't make the game so complicated. I remember once we were trying to play a game and this person was explaining the game. It was so complicated. At one point, he just looked at us and went, "No, we won't do this." And we gave up.
I think that's the thing. It needs to be something that is relatively easy rules in most cases.
Easy to pick up, easy to follow.
Or easy to pick up, yeah. Now, we went camping with a niece and her kids a year or so ago, and they bought a full-size football with them to kick around. Now, we didn't think about saying, well, probably not a good thing to bring and in fact it actually worked out because we had a large open paddock that we were camped in. But had we have chosen somewhere else, a couple of other sites we normally would have used, the football would have been totally useless. Tennis balls work well, frisbees, and you can get travel frisbees that fold down and are material based and just will fold into a pack. So there are plenty of options that you can use to play games on a trail.
Yeah, and again, the thing about the football was that the boys loved their football. They were prepared to carry it, and they had a bit of fun.
Okay, so this one's a bit of a rarity here. As I said, not something we typically do, but for a lot of people, particularly if you are travelling with kids, having options for playing games is something that's worthwhile considering. And in fact, if you're trying to encourage kids to come hiking and you haven't told them that their electronics aren't going to work, it may be good to provide some options. And we haven't actually mentioned mobile phones. Quite often people will have games loaded onto their phones, but that only works as long as there's battery power. And if you're going away for 2, 3, 4, 5 days, that's not going to last very long. So having some alternatives there to keep people amused are well worth having.
Yeah, and I think, if you're travelling with a group of people that you don't know particularly well, one relatively common, easy to play, fun game is a great icebreaker. So, you don't want to carry a whole bag of games, but one you enjoy and one most others might enjoy. So, it's a good way to get to know people and, engage with them.
Okay, we hope you've enjoyed this episode on games on the trail. And as I said, this may be something that that you might look at or you may not be interested in at all. But as I said, if you're travelling with kids, well worth considering. That's all for this week's episode. In our next episode, due for release in 2 weeks' time, we're looking at doing a trail interview, and we've yet to work out which one that is. We've got a couple of options we're working on at the moment. So keep an eye out for that one in 2 weeks' time. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.